Okay, hey, welcome to Psychological Disorders Part 2, if you will. We're going to pick up right after talking about anxiety disorders and start in with mood disorders, right? And kind of the big thing about mood disorders to understand is mood disorders are more than just being sad or just feeling down, right? We all have days where we're not feeling great. We all have maybe even, a few days or a week where, we're depressive, right? We don't feel good psychologically, physically, whatever the impact is, right? It's like we have these down moments. But depression and other mood disorders are much more than just that. So, for instance, when we look at mood disorders, one of the first ones is major depressive disorder. And diagnosing major depressive disorder, like other diagnoses, requires looking at the whole pattern rather than just one or two simple symptoms, right? I mean, we can't just take a couple of symptoms and go, here we go, right? So you have this symptom and so therefore you're depressed. No, it's more complex than that. And depression crosses the line into a disorder when it impairs the individual's daily functioning or causes significant distress for them. Okay. So if we look at this list, right, the pattern that we're going to see is you have one or both of the first two symptoms and then 3 to 4 of the rest of the symptoms that last at least 2 weeks, right? So, or more than 2 weeks is another way to say it. Okay. And so as we look at this, we have to understand, right? So what's actually going on and very carefully assess this. So the first two, and this is one you have to have one of or both of. You have either depressed mood most of the day and or a markedly diminished interest or pleasure in activities. And so when we talk about this diminished interest or pleasure in activities, we're talking about where somebody typically enjoys doing certain things and all of a sudden we notice less interest in those things, right? And, we can look at all sorts of different examples. It could be, they enjoy going out with their friends. It could be that they go to coffee every Friday night. It could be that, they play sports. It could be sexual activity. It could be all sorts of things. But all of a sudden, the person is no longer interested or they don't find the same amount of pleasure in those activities. And then we look at this and we say we have to have 3 or 4 or more of the following: significant increase, decrease in appetite or weight. And the criteria here related to weight loss doesn't include the idea of deliberate dieting. Understand that, right? So, we wouldn't factor that in. Insomnia, sleeping too much or disrupted sleep, lethargy or physical agitation, fatigue or loss of energy nearly every day, worthlessness or an excessive, inappropriate amount of guilt, daily problems in thinking, concentrating, and or making decisions, and having recurring thoughts of death or suicide. So again, we would have one or both of the first two and at least 3 or 4 of the following symptoms after that in order to diagnose it as major depressive disorder, and it would have to last for at least 2 weeks. Now, as we look at depression, we understand that depression is everywhere, right? Shows up in people seeking treatment, but the reality is phobias are actually the most common or most frequently experienced disorder. However, depression is the number one reason that people seek mental health services. And we know that depression appears worldwide, right? Per year, depressive episodes happen to about 6% of men and about 9% of women. And over the course of a lifetime, 12% of Canadians and 17% of US residents experience some form of depression. So often, because depression is seen like it is, people refer to it as the common cold of disorders, which really honestly ticks me off because it's not like the common cold. They're both pervasive. They both occur frequently, but it doesn't work because when you look at depression, it's far more dangerous because there's a high risk of suicide, right? When we look at the idea of having a cold doesn't kill someone, all right? Depression kills people. It kills a lot of people who finally look at it and give up and commit suicide. It has fewer observable symptoms. People who have depression are experts at putting on the mask and not letting people know that they are depressed. And it's more longer lasting than a cold, and it's much less likely to go away with just time. However, sometimes depression does go away with time, but not very often. And the thing with depression is it's really not contagious, right? It's not contagious. The cold is contagious. And here's the big one, really. Depressive pain is way beyond the sniffles. Way beyond the sniffles. So I challenge you to never refer to depression as the common cold of disorders as so many people like to do. Now, speaking of cold, though, let's look at seasonal affective disorder, because this is a whole lot more than not liking or simply disliking winter, okay? Seasonal affective disorder involves recurring seasonal pattern of depression. Got that? It's a recurring seasonal pattern of depression, usually tied to shorter, darker, colder days during the winter. And one way they looked at this was they did a survey and they asked people, have you cried today? And the result was simple. More people say yes in the wintertime. So we look at August, men, 4% of men that were asked actually said they cried that day, 7% of women. But when we asked them in December, it goes up to 8% of men and 21% of women. So you see a double in the men and a triple in the women. All right, next one. Bipolar disorder used to be called manic depressive disorder. And it's really, like it sounds, bipolar. It's about two opposite poles of behavior. Mania is the behavior that is all about being hyper elevated, right? It's about being in a wonderful mood and grandiosity, okay? Overly optimistic. And so what we do is we can compare the symptoms here, and they move between these two poles specifically, right? So they look at their depressed mood and they have this stuck feeling. They're down, right? They just feel down. They're depressed. They have an exaggerated pessimism, social withdrawal, lack of felt pleasure, inactivity, no initiative, difficulty focusing, and fatigue, and an excessive desire to just sleep. Now, mania, on the other hand, exact opposite. Euphoric, giddy, easily irritated. They have exaggerated optimism, hypersociality, and sexuality, right? Go out and live the world and enjoy it. Delight in absolutely everything then. Impulsivity, overactivity, racing thoughts, the mind won't slow down or settle down. And then very little desire for sleep. So we see this, opposites here, and people move between these, and there really isn't like an absolute time frame. I mean, as you look at this, a typical pattern is 3 to 7 weeks of depression and then 3 to 7 days of mania. Think about that. 3 to 7 weeks of depression, 3 to 7 days of mania. That's not much of the mania. That's not much of the really go out and enjoy life a whole lot, right? So it really brings up some interesting ideas, though, when we look at famous people, because there's a lot of famous people we look at, very successful people that have lived with the ups and downs of bipolar disorder. And some researchers will speculate that the depressive periods gave them ideas, and then the manic episodes gave them the creative energy to actually create, right? So kind of a fascinating approach. Now, one of the questions that's often asked too is whether children and adolescents who have swings in mood have bipolar disorder, or do they have something else, or can we just not diagnose them? Well, the 2013 edition of the Diagnostic Manual, the DSM-5, right, added the new diagnosis that we actually see here. And it's all about the idea that prior to puberty, children don't really have this manic swing. What they have instead is they have a depressive up to a rage swing, and they move into a full extended rage, extreme anger management issues. And so the DSM-5 has that new diagnosis for disruptive mood dysregulation disorder, and that is all about adolescence, right? So we look at this, we see this as, a challenge. Prior to puberty, it would be the equivocal of bipolar disorder, but we don't see bipolar disorder prior to puberty. So as we look at mood disorders, we look at, a couple of interesting facts here. As we look across, multiple countries, here's Belgium, France, Israel, USA, Spain. We see that almost everywhere around the world, women tend to be more susceptible to depression, except in Spain. It's the only country where it's, not that way. And there's a couple of explanations we might be able to come to. One, kind of the obvious, and a lot of people pick up on this one, is maybe men just don't report it. Maybe because of the gender role that men are assigned in society, they actually don't run out and try and get help. They don't want to admit that they are weak, because that's exactly how it'd be interpreted most of the time when we use the gender roles we're given as men. But there's another factor too, and that's the idea that women tend to ruminate more, right? So what they do is they actually have an event that bothers them, and rather than, like most men, walking away and going, okay, that's done and over, whatever, they walk away and they replay everything in their head that has gone wrong with it, right? So literally they start thinking about, well, I should have said this, I could have said that, next time I'll say this, and they just replay it over and over and over. Women typically, too, have a deeper sadness than men, all right? And will encounter a lot more stressors. I mean, if we're really honest, women carry a lot of burden, if you will, especially women with children, right? And women with children who are married or in a relationship and trying to take care of a home and going out and, doing the different things that, they're supposed to do, having a job, cleaning the house, doing laundry, da 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 da. It becomes extremely stressful. So women generally would carry a few more stressors or encounter more stressors. So with mood disorders, some of the things we ask is, why does depression often go away on its own? And is the course of development, or what's the course of development of reactive depression? See, oftentimes we come back to that time heals all wounds idea, right? And the reality is that's typical of reactive depression, where we see reactive depression where people have a major event like loss of a loved one, loss of a job, loss of school event, being dropped out of school or something along those lines, causes reactive depression. And reactive depression will create a temporary period of withdrawal, worry, and feeling down. And so therefore, you may have the symptoms and even be diagnosable as having disorders of depression, but it's reactive and it may actually go away on its own. Time may actually heal that wound. So when we look at trying to understand mood disorders, we can look at biological aspects, and we will, evolutionary, genetic, brain, body, and then we'll look at social cognitive aspects, which really, to cut short, is about your stinking thinking, right? So we'll talk about that in detail. So first, evolutionary perspective on biology of depression. Depression in its most mild, non-disordered form may have had a survival value, especially seasonal affective disorder if you think about it, because you typically withdraw from the society, you withdraw from people, you stay inside when you actually have a milder form of depression, so you just withdraw. Well, that could protect you in some ways. As a matter of fact, in high stress situations, we may actually be going into a social emotional hibernation, which allows us to conserve energy because maybe we've expended too much energy and we need to step back and conserve our energy for a while. It helps us avoid conflicts, other risks. I always joke about this, but seriously, how many times have you thought to yourself, I better not go to work, I better not go to school, I better not go to insert here, right, today, because I'm in a mood and I will have a problem, I'll have a conflict, right? Something will happen. And so it's a reality. Sometimes we have this in order to avoid conflicts or other risks, right? And then two, it can help us let go of unattainable goals. Now, look, again, I stress this. I am very humanistic in the core of psychology, if you think about it. And I really believe every human being wants to be better, and I believe that every human being can be better. Unfortunately, sometimes being better doesn't mean achieving something that somebody wants to achieve. Sometimes goals are a little bit too lofty, okay? And so sometimes we have to let go of unattainable goals, and depression can help us kind of move through those. And then two, it gives us time to contemplate life's events or contemplate what's going on around us. So there could be some survival aspects here. Now, when we look at genetics, right, we do know that there is DNA linkage analysis that shows a depressed gene region, and twin adoption heritability studies have shown us that several disorders are actually heritable. So, for instance, we see bipolar, schizophrenia, anorexia nervosa, major depressive disorder, and generalized anxiety disorder, as you see there, percentage-wise, of the ability to actually inherit it genetically. So when we look at the brain activity is diminished in depression and increased in mania. And when we look at brain structure, we see smaller frontal lobes in depression and fewer axons in bipolar disorder. And then we also see some communication issues going on in the neurotransmitters. So for instance, we see a lot more norepinephrine arousing the brain in mania, but much less in depression. And so in depression, we see reduced amounts of serotonin. And you can see this person's brain here. It's the same person, right? We see these brains here. And the person is in a depressed state May 17th, and you don't see a whole lot of activity. They're in a manic state on the 18th. You see a lot of activity. And then on the 27th, they're back in a depressed state, and you see very little activity, right? So we definitely see a biological tie here. Then we come to suicide and self-injury. Every year, 1 million people commit suicide. They don't try. 1 million people actually commit suicide. This is 1 million people that have given up, right? They've quit. They've come to a point in their life where they believe that they are so trapped, so isolated, that they see absolutely no end to the feelings that they have, that they feel so ineffective, that they feel like nobody is there for them and nobody can help them, and they literally just give up. Beyond that 1 million who succeed, a lot more attempt suicide or make suicidal gestures, which are acts that look like suicide attempts without any clear intent to succeed. And then the numbers get a lot larger if we consider those who have had thoughts about suicide, so just suicidal ideation, or not even just thinking about suicide, but wishing that they were actually dead, right? So when we look at this, we see a lot of different things happening here. It becomes a really concerning area. And then we see non-suicidal self-injury, which has different functions like sending a message or distracting from emotional pain, giving yourself permission to feel, or just self-punishment, right? And when we look at this, non-suicidal self-injury, I always think of the Johnny Cash version or the Nine Inch Nails version of the song Hurt, right? I hurt myself today to see if I still feel. I focused on the pain, the only thing that's real. And so when you think about that, a lot of times that's what non-suicidal self-injury is all about. Okay, let's look at thinking. We know that depression is associated sometimes with low self-esteem, right? Learned helplessness, which we talked about in class. Rumination, right? Continuing to relive, rethink, thinking it over and over and over. And then we add this negative thinking style called the depressive explanatory style. And so the depressive explanatory style can be predictive of how we're actually going to respond to traumatic or bad events. So let's look at the breakup with a romantic partner, because everybody has that at some point in time in their life. So there's certain assumptions that people make. They could make a stable assumption, I'll never get over this, or a temporary assumption, which is more healthy, this sucks, but you know what, I'm going to get through it, okay? Or the problem is global, without my partner, I can't seem to do anything right, or they're going to be very specific. I miss my partner, but you know what? I've got family, I've got friends, I have other people that actually can help me, okay? Or they look at internally and they say, our breakup was all my fault, or externally, it takes two to make a relationship work, and if they weren't willing to work on it, then it just wasn't meant to be, obviously. So what's the end result? Well, what the chart implies here is that the negative explanatory style leads to depression, right? So, I mean, this is the reality. But see, here's where the real problem comes in, is when you have the negative explanatory style or the depressive explanatory style, and you put it into this vicious cycle, right? We see where somebody has a traumatic event or a stressful experience, a stressful experience. Let's say the breakup of the significant other. They go through the negative explanatory style. It's all my fault. I'm never going to get over this. They end up in a depressed mood. Because of the depression, they end up with cognitive and behavioral changes. Maybe they end up skipping class a few times. That drops their grade to a failing grade. That's a stressful experience. They have a negative explanatory cycle about it. They begin to think to themselves, oh my gosh, I'm never going to get through this. This is all my fault. I can't blame anybody else. Oh wow, I'm never going to make it through school. They increase their level of depression. They have more cognitive behavioral changes. And then they screw up at work and they lose their job. More stressful experience, negative, 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 more depression, 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 more change. See how this works? It just goes around and around and around. The depressed mood changes a person's style of thinking and interacting in a way that makes more stressful experiences to be more likely, right? So really, again, it's about stinking thinking. Now, how do we change this though? I mean, how do we actually help people with depression? Much less, think about this. How do you help yourself with depression? Well, interestingly enough, when I was doing a continuing education for medical professionals in Washington State a few years ago, I put together some information on depression treatment. And when we compared 93 depression treatments of 5,760 patients, this is what we actually found, right? We saw the worsening level towards the bottom and the improvement level towards the top, and then the percentage of success as we go across, all right? So as we look at this, right, we see things on the far left here, right, in the bottom, lithium, trazodone, Effexor, Paxil, right? So the drugs, well, they're not really doing a whole lot for somebody, right? Nor is flaxseed oil or St. John's wort or other homeopathic garbage like that. Then we move up the chart, right, on the left, and we see, okay, well, more people had more success with things like music therapy, art therapy, than they did with trazodone, Effexor, lithium, right, flaxseed oil, things like this. But as we go across, we see some really fascinating things, right? Things that were tried that, some worked for some people, like, the Prozac worked for some people, journaling, using vitamins, masturbation, caffeine. Notice alcohol is not a good option at all, okay? But then up at the top, we go all the way across and we go way up in the upper right-hand corner. The number one thing, exercise, right? Getting out, being active, exercising, getting on the treadmill, whatever it is, exercise is critical. It really is. And then right near that is adequate sleep and spending time with family, friends, talk therapy, time with a pet. Not drinking, right, is there. So we see some things very specifically that can actually help with depression. All right, let's talk about schizophrenia. Now, here's the thing. There is a whole video from one of my abnormal psychology classes that has the schizophrenic lecture in it. Okay, it goes much more in depth than what I'm going to do here. So I encourage you to check that out and watch it. All right, but here we're going to look at schizophrenic symptoms and causes of those symptoms. So when we look at schizophrenia, what is it? Well, it's the mind being split from reality. In other words, it's a split from one's own thoughts so that they appear as hallucinations. So a psychosis refers to that mental split from reality and rationality. And schizophrenic symptoms include disorganized, delusional thinking, disturbed perceptions, and diminished and inappropriate emotions. Okay, so when we actually look at this, then we have what we call positive and negative symptoms of schizophrenia. We have the positive, meaning they are there, they're present. The negative, meaning they're absent, but they should be there. So for instance, in the positive category, we start with hallucinations, right? Especially auditory. Auditory hallucinations are one of the most common hallucinations for people to have. However, you can have any form of hallucination. You can have auditory, you can have visual, you can have gustatory, you can have tactile, you can have olfactory. I mean, there's all sorts of ways for you to hallucinate, and your brain can play with you all sorts of ways. Delusions, illusory beliefs, especially that people are being persecuted, right? Disorganized thought and nonsensical speech, or bizarre behaviors. Now, on the negative side, the absence of healthy behaviors, we see the flat effect, no emotion, right? We see reduced social interaction, anhedonia, the inability to feel joy, avolition, having no motivation or initiative, no focus on tasks, alogia, speaking less, and then catatonia, moving less, right? So we see all of these symptoms, and we can have somebody who presents with just positive or just negative, or we can have somebody that actually presents with some of both, right? So there's different types of schizophrenia that are actually out there. So when we look at the problems in thinking and speaking, we look at what we call the disorganized speech, and we call it the word salad often, okay? And the word salad is where people put together loosely associated phrases. Then we have delusions, illusory beliefs, often bizarre, not just mistaken. Most common, though, are either delusions of grandeur or delusions of persecution, all right? So those are the most common when we actually look at this. It is not uncommon, as a matter of fact, and I've seen this quite a few times, where you'll talk to somebody who is homeless, who has schizophrenia, and they will have some story along the lines of they were CIA, they were special forces, they were black ops, they were something along those lines, and they're living on the street to avoid the government because the government wants to kill them, right? So they have the delusions of grandeur and the delusions of persecution, all right? Problems with selective attention, right? They'll have difficulty filtering thoughts and choosing which thoughts to believe and which ones to say out loud. Then we have the disturbed perceptions. People with schizophrenia will often experience hallucinations, right? And those are perceptual experiences that only they're sharing, right? And they'll hear voices, especially telling them they're evil or they're bad, all right? And the most common form then is those voices, right? It's shaming, right? It's upsetting content, or even content that tells them to do something bad, right? So for instance, the Son of Sam serial killer was listening to his dog Sam, and Sam was telling him who to actually kill. But hallucinations, like I said, can also be all sorts of ways. They can be visual, olfactory, tactile, gustatory. They can be all sorts of ways that they're actually experienced. They have inappropriate emotions and actions, odd and socially inappropriate responses like looking bored or amused while hearing of someone's death, or they'll have flat effect. You can tell them they won the lottery or their mother died, and they're just not going to respond whatsoever. Impaired perception of emotions. They don't have the ability to read other people's emotions or their intent. And the schizophrenic body exhibits symptoms like repetitive behaviors like rocking, rubbing. I remember one person that would actually take his pointer finger and his thumb and make kind of a U and stuff them into his mouth, and he'd rub them back and forth on his gums nonstop, and his gums would be bleeding, but he'd still be rubbing him back and forth. So it was just this nonstop, constant rubbing that he had to do. Or they can go the complete opposite. They can go into catatonia and have basically no movement, right? Be completely unresponsive for hours. So when we look at the onset development of schizophrenia, it's kind of fascinating because typically schizophrenic symptoms will appear towards the end of adolescence and in early adulthood, but a little bit later for women than for men typically. About 1% of the population develops schizophrenia. Slightly more men than women actually develop it. And the development can either be acute reactive or chronic. And it matters. It really does, right? Because when we actually look at acute reactive schizophrenia, that's reaction to a stressful event. Okay, so some people develop positive symptoms like the hallucinations based on going through a traumatic event. And the good news is recovery is likely for those individuals. Whereas chronic process schizophrenia develops much more slowly. It'll have the negative symptoms with it. And with treatment and support, there might be periods of time that they live a normal life, but they're never going to be cured. And the real problem, again, I've said this before, is that oftentimes a schizophrenic, even on medication during that normal period of life, they will stop using their medication because they don't want to be abnormal. They want to be normal, and then they'll go back into another psychotic break or psychosis. Okay? Without treatment, this type of schizophrenia typically leads to poverty and social problems like homelessness, which is really a big problem for the schizophrenic. Well, let's look at a schizophrenic and let her kind of tell you the story, if you will. This is Kate, and Kate's an artist. And she started having hallucinations and was diagnosed with schizophrenia at age 17. So in order to share her story with everyone and let people know what she was actually experiencing, she began to draw her hallucinations. So as we look at this, here's what she said. She says, "I draw a lot of my hallucinations as drawing helps me deal with it." This is a figure that she'll see sometimes called the Messiah. In her hallucinations, she hears voices, sound effects, random noises. She often sees bugs, faces, and disembodied eyes. So these are all things that she'll see and literally will see in front of her. She hallucinates bugs a lot, and her depression makes her feel worthless like a fly. And so this bug illustration represents her illness, right? And the negative thoughts like, okay, I hope you choke on your cigarette smoke. This one will crawl out of the wall or out of the vent, right? And run around and hide underneath things. This is how she sees herself. This is a self-portrait of her looking at herself in the mirror. She has this one voice that tells her to light things on fire. And this is an example of the disembodied eyes that she sees. They surface in mounds or masses on her walls and floors, and she says that they'll actually warp and they'll move around. And then this bird actually will sing to her. So she'll see this bird and the bird sings to her. And her self-esteem when her self-esteem is at its lowest, she feels insignificant. And she's always wishing that she could shapeshift into a prettier person. So she hears this, if she steals their beauty, she'll have her own, right? So, another negative voice telling her to do bad things. And then sometimes she sees eyes, odd colored circles around them, right? They'll just show up. And then organization, communication, paranoia, depression, anxiety, and managing her emotions are all the biggest struggles for her, right? So that's kind of a quick glimpse into a schizophrenic. So what's going on in the brain in schizophrenia? We're going to look at a couple of things. Let's look at abnormal brain structure, and then also beyond abnormal brain structure and activity, we look at the idea of dopamine, or delta 4 receptors especially, right? And they explain the paranoia and hallucinations because it's like taking an amphetamine overdose all the time, right? So it's like they're constantly taking an amphetamine overdose. There's also this issue that they have poor coordination of neural firing in the frontal lobes, right? That impairs judgment and their ability to self-control. And their thalamus fires during hallucinations. So for them, they really are experiencing. In other words, because the thalamus is firing, it's like the sensations are really being received. So the brain is processing information like it's real life. And we also see general shrinking of various brain areas and connections between them in the actual brain. So are there biological risk factors affecting early development? Yeah, schizophrenia is more likely to develop when one or more of these factors is present, either low birth weight, maternal diabetes, older paternal age, famine, oxygen deprivation during delivery, or maternal virus during mid-pregnancy impairing brain development. Schizophrenia is also more likely to develop in babies born during and after flu epidemics, in densely populated areas, a few months after flu season, and after mothers had the flu during the second trimester or had antibodies showing a viral infection. So the lesson there really is to get your flu shots with early fall pregnancies. It really is important. What other genetic risk factors? Well, we could also look at twin studies, right? And we see where we look at fraternal and identical twins are much more likely to both have schizophrenia. So if one twin has it, the chance of the other one also having it is much greater when they're identical. Having adoptive siblings, however, has nothing to do with it. Adoptive siblings with schizophrenia is not going to impact another person's likelihood of developing schizophrenia. This is genetic, not environmental. All right, even in quadruplets, genetics do not fully predict schizophrenia, though, and it could be because of the environmental differences that people go through. First difference, though, is seen in twins with separate placentas, okay? All right, here we actually see only one of two twins that has enlarged ventricles that are seen in schizophrenia, and you see where the arrow is pointing to show you the normal, in the no schizophrenia, the normal kind of size of those ventricles, whereas you see the ventricles on the individual with schizophrenia are much larger, right? So more wasted area. Okay, what other disorders are there? Well, there's a lot, but what are we going to look at here? Well, we'll look at dissociative disorders briefly, and APD briefly, and then eating disorders, and we'll wrap it up there. So dissociative disorders, dissociation is a simple idea where it's about separation from conscious awareness from thoughts, memory, bodily sensation, feeling, and even separating from identity, all right? So kind of like spacing out, except for on a much grander scale, okay? Now, a dissociative disorder is where this causes dysfunction and distress because of chronic or severe dissociation. Examples would be dissociative fugue state, right? Which, oh, that's nice. Running away or wandering away from one's life, right? Memory, having no memory of them, or dissociative identity disorder, which is the development of separate personalities. So look at DID, all right? So dissociative identity disorder used to be called multiple personality disorder. And in the rare actual cases of DID, the personalities are distinct and they are not present in the consciousness at the same time. And they may or may not appear to be aware of each other. Okay. Now, dissociative identities might be an extreme form of role playing, though, is what some people would actually use as an alternate explanation. Or DID in North America might be a more cultural construct, similar to the idea of being possessed by evil spirits. Or cases of DID might be created or worsened by a therapist, by encouraging people to think about the different parts of themselves. That's what some people like to explain as alternate explanations. But if we look and we ask, did or did not, right? Is DID real? Is there evidence that DID is real? Well, in genuine cases, yeah, we can actually see it because here's some interesting stuff. Different personalities have involved different brainwave patterns, right? Literally distinct brainwave patterns. Different handedness, and not like you struggled with in class trying to sign your name with your dominant and then your non-dominant hand, but literally competent different handedness and different visual acuity and eye muscle patterns, right? So you actually see differences in this. So patients with DID also show heightened activity in areas of the brain that's associated with managing and inhibiting traumatic memories. A lot of people may explain this different ways. Psychoanalytic may say this is a diverting id. Cognitive perspective could say that coping with abuse is what is happening here. Learning perspective says dissociation pays. The person learned that dissociating pays, and so therefore they're going to dissociate so they don't get in trouble. And then social influence argues that therapists actually encourage this. But again, I mean, there's a lot of evidence that it is there, all right? So when it's a real case. Eating disorders. We have anorexia nervosa, bulimia nervosa, and binge eating. These may involve unrealistic body images, extreme body ideals. Horrible, horrible idea here in the way we deal with what the ideal body is for male or female in the U.S. and many other countries. It's a desire to control food and the body when one's situation can't be controlled. So, in other words, people may go to eating disorders because other parts of their life are so far out of control that they feel like they have control here. It can be cycles of depression that actually cause this, or health problems that bring it about. And so when we look at this, here's what we actually see. We see anorexia nervosa is a compulsion to lose weight coupled with the certainty about being fat, even though the individual is typically 15% or more underweight, okay? About 0.6% meet criteria at some time during their lifetime. Bulimia nervosa is a compulsion to binge, eat large amounts, and then purge, either through vomit, laxatives, or extreme exercise. About 1% hit that. And then binge eating, compulsion to binge, followed by guilt and depression. And we're not talking about that one night that you ate the whole thing of ice cream because you were really down in the dumps. We're talking about this is a repeating issue, right? So, and it's causing significant distress, maladaptive behavior, dysfunction, okay? About 2.8% prevalence on that. There's some family factors that are tied with this too. Having a mother focused on her weight and on a child's appearance and weight, negative self-evaluation in the family, and then for bulimia, if childhood obesity runs in the family. For anorexia, families are competitive, high achieving, and protective. And then there's cultural factors too, which is primarily, number one, unrealistic ideals of body appearance, right? What should a body really look like becomes a really fascinating question. Well, it should be the one that you were born with, right? The one that naturally you were given. Personality disorders. Personality disorders are enduring patterns of social and other behavior that impair an individual's social functioning. And there's three clusters or categories: anxious or avoidant PD, there is eccentric, odd, schizoid PD, and then dramatic, histrionic, narcissistic, antisocial. All right, so those are the ones that we would primarily see in our three areas. All right, APD is one that people tend to talk a lot about. An antisocial personality disorder is a persistent acting out without conscience, without a sense of guilt, in other words. So they don't feel bad for what they did to strangers or family or anyone, doesn't matter. Friends, family, strangers, doesn't matter, okay? And we have a specific diagnostic criteria, of course, including a pattern of violating the rights of others after the age of 15, including at least three of these: deceitfulness, disregard for safety of self or others, aggressiveness, failure to conform to social norms, lack of remorse, impulsivity and failure to plan ahead, irritability, and irresponsibility regarding family, money, or jobs. Okay, so a lot of job hopping or not spending money correctly. So interestingly enough, one of the questions asked is, which kids may develop APD as adults? About half of children with persistent antisocial behavior develop lifelong APD. Which kids are at risk? Well, there's specific psychological factors. Those who in preschool were impulsive, uninhibited, unconcerned with social rewards, and were very low in anxiety. Those who endured child abuse and or inconsistent or completely unavailable caretaking. And then there's biological APD risk factors too. Antisocial, unemotional biological relatives increase the risk. There's some genes that are associated with this. Lower levels of stress hormones and low physiological arousal in stressful situations. Fear conditioning being impaired. Reduced prefrontal cortex tissue leads to impulsivity because you don't have that good judgment base. And then substance dependence is much more likely in this individual. But here's the thing about APD. They're not criminals, right? Many people think that, the antisocial personality disorder is the reason for all the people who commit crime. And the reality is there's more people with APD that do not commit crimes than there's people with APD that do commit crimes, right? So there's just no truth to that idea. All right, let's see here. Here we go. There. Rates of psychological disorders. So if we look at kind of a rate of psychological disorders, we see here kind of the growing, continuum back and forth. You see that generalized anxiety, about 3.1%, social phobia, almost 7%, phobia of a specific object, almost 9%, mood disorder, about 9.5%, OCD, 1%, schizophrenia, 1.1%, post-traumatic stress, 3.5%, attention deficit, 4.1%, or any mental disorder, we see about 26.2%, all right? So we see, these different rates and prevalence of mental health diagnoses. So these are the big ones, really, the ones that have their own numbers that we see. But there's factors that really matter. So there's vulnerable factors, right? And so we ask, who's vulnerable to this? Who's most likely to actually develop a mental disorder? Well, the first thing that we know is individuals living in poverty, right? Poverty increases the risk of many mental disorders, including aggression and anxiety, okay? And disorders decrease when poverty is lifted. And there's a lot of reasons for that. I mean, there really is when you look. There's a lot of issues around, stressors, cortisol. There's issues around the idea of access to health care or quality of education. All sorts of things begin to play when we use poverty as the key to look at. But then we have the immigrant paradox, right? Despite the stress of immigrating, people who immigrate into the United States have a lower risk of disorders than their children born in the United States. So kind of an interesting point. Then we look at age of vulnerability. Many disorders show in early adulthood, right? So late adolescence, early adulthood, we begin to see them there. Developing on average around age 20, we see OCD, schizophrenia, bipolar, and alcohol use disorder. Showing some signs earlier would be phobias around age 10 and APD as young as 8. Developing later than 20, major depressive disorder typically. All right, outcomes for people with psychological disorders. There's risks to be watchful of, obstacles to be overcome, and improvements to be made, often with the help of treatment. But the point is they do need treatment because some people with psychological disorders never recover, right? Some achieve greatness even with a psychological disorder. So even if you have a psychological disorder, it's still a factor that, you could still be very successful. So then who seeks treatment? Well, this is kind of the fascinating point. Again, we go to poverty and some things like this. And we can see that, for instance, more whites than blacks or Hispanics actually seek treatment. More women seek treatment than men. Age-wise, more people over 17. When we look at marital status, if people are married, they're less likely to seek treatment versus being never married or divorced or separated. And then one of the big ones, having insurance, right? If you have public insurance, more people were likely to seek it, whereas private insurance, people were more likely to seek it versus none. The interesting thing about the public insurance stat here is this is one of those stats you look at and you go, it's really kind of fascinating. Is it because the insurance didn't cost people anything? It's public insurance, so they're more... No, they're likely on public insurance because of a disorder to begin with, right? Or a physical ailment to begin with. So it's kind of an interesting thing, again, where we see a poverty factor, right, playing in here. So we see it all over the place. All right, mental illness and homelessness. Unfortunately, many people with serious mental illnesses receive really short-term inpatient treatment, and then they're sent right back to the communities, and they're not prepared, and the communities aren't prepared to provide adequate outpatient care, and so they end up back in inpatient treatment through the revolving door. They end up basically homeless a lot of times too, or homeless completely. Some researchers argue that this has significantly increased homelessness, this revolving door, while others see homelessness problem as really an economic one. But it's really a mental health issue. I mean, I would argue that we can't separate the two. I mean, the economics play into it, but certainly the mental illness is one of the main reasons that people are out there homeless. Okay, here it is. That is our lecture on psych disorders. I hope you all have a great weekend, and we will see you in class. As always, if you have questions,